With Peter Jennings.
Good evening. One military officer said today the waging of war is flat out simple. The restoration of peace is a challenge. In the war, a Saudi Arabian official said today he thinks the Iraqis suffered 85 to 100,000 casualties. For the generals, it is now a time to police the battlefield and await a formal ceasefire. For the politicians, it is time to think of rebuilding the region. For the men and women who fought the war, it is time for another countdown. We begin tonight with ABC's Bob Zelnick on who will be coming home first and when.
Pentagon plans call for the U.S. to begin withdrawing forces within the next 2 weeks. But sources here warn that withdrawal will be a lengthy process.
It was a Herculean logistic task to get them there. And thank God, because our casualties were so light, it's going to be just about as Herculean to get them back.
According to Pentagon plans, among the first Army units to be called home in coming weeks will be from the Rapid Deployment Force ordered to the Gulf last August. These include the 82nd Airborne from Fort Bragg, the 101st Airborne from Fort Campbell, and the 24th Mechanized Infantry from Fort Stewart.
Right now, this country has no strategic reserve ground force in the country. So from a strategic national standpoint, it's important to get those units home first.
Military sources say that 2 Marine Expeditionary Brigades and other elements from the 1st Marine Division, which also arrived in the country last summer, will also be among the first to leave. Air Force officials privately expect fighter aircraft and their crews to begin departing Saudi Arabia within the next week or two. But Pentagon sources expect at least 2 air wings plus a vast amount of pre-positioned weapons and equipment to remain in Saudi Arabia. Navy sources say that 2 carrier battle groups, the Saratoga and the Kennedy, will shortly be leaving the area to be replaced by the carriers Forrestal and Nimitz. A heavy naval presence using port facilities in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia will remain for years. It is not clear yet when the 75,000 reservists in the region will leave. Some will be needed to help Kuwait rebuild. These include specialists in mine clearing, as well as engineers, civil affairs officers, and morticians. And some of the reserve troops, who are specialists in transportation and logistics, will have to stay on duty for a while, loading the regular troops and equipment or carrying them home. Bob Zelnick, ABC News at the Pentagon.
The military briefer at the Pentagon, General Kelly, said today that as of now, in his view, the Iraqi army is a rabble. And now with the war's sudden end, we're just beginning to get a real look at what it was like. ABC's Jim Wooten has been with the Army's 3rd Armored Division. They saw some of the heaviest fighting.
They rolled into Iraq on the first day of the war and spent the next 2 chasing an enemy on the run. They were looking for someone to fight. Yesterday morning, they found him. Some of the Republican Guard in Soviet-built tanks finally turned, having decided to defend their homeland. And the 3rd Armored's 3rd Brigade took them head-on.
You got the grid on that 9 T-72 suspected that we got from Lead? Roger, we do. Okay, we're still sneaking up to take a look at that, but I don't want to go past these bunkers till we shoot above them.
They combined pinpoint artillery with laser-guided rockets from multiple launch systems. And on call, an Air Force F-16, falling like a rock on its target. It dropped cluster bombs. 2,800 separate detonations. From then on, it was a rout. Most of the Iraqis fled. Many hundreds surrendered, eager to be captured, thanking the Americans for the food and water. Some who'd tried to run were decapitated by their officers, their bodies left in their trenches. Those few who decided to fight died, turned to ash in their vehicles. Oddly enough, on this modern armored battlefield, there were almost no craters, only direct hits. And the 3rd Armored raced on, headed east into Kuwait, destroying more than an entire division's worth of Iraqi armor. leaving behind only their tracks and the glow of dead tanks burning in the desert dusk. If there ever was any confusion about the essential objective of the Americans, at least, that's certainly been removed in the last couple of days. It wasn't terrain and it wasn't territory. It was the complete and utter destruction of an army already badly beaten. And even with the ceasefire in effect, that destruction continued. This abandoned Iraqi armored personnel carrier, with ammunition supplied courtesy of Jordan, was bypassed in yesterday's headlong assault. Today, along with dozens of others, it wasn't.
We're destroying a lot of the old equipment. Not old equipment, well, they're old equipment, but we're making sure it's not going to be used again.
It could have been a lot tougher than this.
We thought it would be. We really did. We thought it'd be a lot tougher.
How can you explain that it hasn't been?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm glad it's like this, but I have no idea why it is.
Only one of Colonel Goff's men was killed, only 2 were wounded, and not a single piece of equipment was lost to Iraqi fire. And after moving 150 miles through the Iraqi desert and 10 more into Kuwait, it was over and done. Jim Wooten, ABC News in northwest Kuwait.
The military says there were no further American casualties overnight. The total remains 79 dead and 45 missing. This represents 1/3 to 1/6 of the Pentagon's lowest estimates before the war began. ABC's Bill Redeker reports on the military picture overall in the Gulf today.
The 100-hour ground war left behind a battlefield littered with destroyed Iraqi tanks. A cemetery of twisted armor that revealed the destructive power of Allied tanks, artillery, and aircraft. U.S. commanders said of the 42 Iraqi divisions committed to the battle and their 4,200 tanks, less than 1 division remained intact and only about 300 tanks survived, most of them having fled back to Iraq. American forces have not withdrawn. Instead, they have taken up defensive positions around Kuwait and southern Iraq in case the ceasefire is broken.
There's a sense of exhilaration and at the same time let down at the end of this thing. Be careful. This is probably the most dangerous part of this operation.
There were 2 violations today. American generals said they believe some Iraqi units didn't get the word.
For instance, at 12:30 this afternoon, Iraqi T-55 tanks and multiple rocket launchers fired on elements of the 18th Airborne Corps as they were trying to remove the remains of U.S. pilots that were killed in a UH-60 helicopter crash. We responded and destroyed 2 T-55 tanks and 2 multiple rocket launchers. That's the way it's going to work.
Cleaning up the battlefield meant blowing up disabled Iraqi tanks and artillery.
We're destroying a lot of the old equipment. Not old equipment, well, they're old equipment, but we're making sure it's not going to be used again.
Other Iraqi armor was abandoned by soldiers who had surrendered. Some of the tanks will be shipped back to the United States for inspection and will be used in training.
This is the mortar right here.
Well, they got a lot of loose grenades laying around inside, too.
The Iraqi torching of Kuwaiti oil wells and destruction of storage tanks has left a mess in the desert. There is so much oil flowing out of broken pipelines and wellheads that black crude is collecting in giant lakes. Some of those responsible for this are now in prisoner of war camps. Late today, the British Ministry of Defense said there could be as many as 175,000 Iraqi POWs. Sorting out those who may be prosecuted for war crimes will be one of the military's most difficult tasks in the coming weeks. In the coming weeks, the most difficult task for 500,000 American troops here will be dealing with the anticipation of going home. These soldiers got the message on the battlefield this morning a few hours before the ceasefire took effect.
In 2 hours, it's over. Who said that?
President Bush.
It's on the radio? What is it? No, man, in 2 hours, it's over. In 2 hours, it's over. Yeah! Isn't peace wonderful?
This is great.
Too bad it couldn't have come sooner.
Tonight, the ceasefire is holding. But as one general here said, the Iraqi army doesn't have much left to break it. Bill Redeker, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
From the Soviets today, realism and a touch of resentment. The Soviets sold Iraq much of its military hardware. Today, the Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov says the failure of Iraqi's air defenses has led the Soviets to review their own air defense system, which he says has weak spots. Another senior Soviet military official says that many of the Soviet weapons used by Iraq were old, and the Iraqi army, in his words, left much to be desired. In a moment, working out the ceasefire and afterwards, joy and outrage in Kuwait City, and chasing away the demons of Vietnam.